Okay, for another request here, somebody wants me to write a speech on the origin of fairy tales. Write a speech on the origin of fairy tales. Hold on a second, let me just see what's going on here. Let me just... Origin of fairy tales. Okay, I'll just do a little bit of research on the... so I know what's going on here. I mean, I would guess that someone back in the day, let's say 800 years ago, roughly, he had some children, and these children were just screaming their heads off every night. The guy was out chopping wood for a living. This is 800 years ago. He needed it to burn the fires. They didn't have electricity and whatnot back then, and these kids of his, he'd get home and he's chopping all day, his arms are killing him, and he just wants to lie down and, sit by his fire with the wood that he's chopped, make a stew, because they all ate stews back then, 800 years ago, and these kids are going, ma, they're bored, they're out of their minds with boredom, they don't know what to do with them, and he can't think straight. So he came up with the brilliant idea to entertain them all by just making stuff up off the top of his head. Make a little fairy tale with a nice happy ending so they're all happy and they'd go to sleep and he could get some peace and quiet. That is my understanding of the origin of fairy tales, but it may not be 100% correct. So let me just check, let's see how close I was to the actual origin of fairy tales. Let's have a look. I've got here, I've just find out. Here we go. The origin of fairy tales, let's see, dates back thousands of years. So I was a little bit off. I said about 800, which was almost 1,000. So I'm going to give myself a tick there, almost. The history of fairy tales or fairy stories have fantasy creatures such as fairies, fae, goblins, elves, trolls, witches, giants, and or talking animals. Well, that all comes under when I said this guy, this lumberjack, whatever his name was, just came up with stuff off the top of his head. And that could be anything. They all come under that. One day he went, so there was these kids and they went across a bridge and there was this hungry, dirty monster type thing. Let's call him a goblin. And just because he had been goblin all night, he'd been goblin his stew. And so it just was the first thing that came to his head. That's where the name goblin comes from. Because this guy was goblin his stew. That's what happens. So that's another tick for me. That's for my origin story. What else? It is not necessary for these tales to be about fairies. They're just called fairy tales because generally fairies are make-believe and whatnot. If there's any kids watching, they're not make-believe. Don't listen to me. It's all real. What else? Enchantments and far-fetched events are also usually part of the plot. Again, another tick. That's saying make stuff up. Unlike legends and folklore tales, they seldom contain any references to religion, actual places, persons, or events. This is all pretty obvious stuff. The term once upon a time is used rather than an actual reference date. Yeah, that's what I said before. I said approximately way back when, somewhere. So it's all ticks all around. My story, I guess my story of the origin of fairy tales is a little more generalised than this, but still correct nonetheless. Anyway, let's keep going. Both long and short fairy tales, folklore, legends and myths have been passed from generation to generation since before recorded history. The origin of these types of oral stories, I said he told them, that's another tick, to oral stories is impossible to determine. All ancient cultures from all over the globe have fairy tales. Early fairy tales were for adults as much as for children. Okay, I didn't mention that, that's a cross. 1 cross to 5, that's not bad. The fairy tales text of the literary type were intended for adults. That's interesting. They became more kids' fairy tales in the 19th and 20th centuries. Grimm and Anderson have kept many, many children entertained with their tales of winged fairies. 2 theories on the origin of fairy tales, one of them mine, have attempted to explain the common elements in the fairy tales text. Actually, no, they're not talking about mine. Text found spread over many continents. One theory is that the tale comes from a single source and spreads from culture to culture over time. The other theory is that these tales reference common human experience. That the many cultures over time tell similar tales of similar human experiences. That's very interesting. The first written tales are from ancient Egypt and occurred around 1300 BC. So that's the origin of fairy tales right there.